right. Good morning or afternoon if you are watching a recording of this event, and welcome to Undercurrent News. This is the real impact of Trump's tariffs on U.S. seafood prices. I'm Jason Huffman, the America's editor and your moderator. The seafood industry, it seems, is always living through unprecedented times, but these are really unprecedented times for importers and exporters of products to the U.S. Thanks to the global trade war Donald Trump declared on April 2nd of this year. After hitting most nations with a standard tariff rate of 10% on that date, which he declared was Liberation Day, over the following 5 to 7 months, he has raised those rates for many nations to 15% or as high as 50%, and he keeps threatening more tariffs. Of course, that doesn't include China, where products have seen combined tariff rates as high as 170%, and include the 25% tariffs that were applied during Trump's first term that just never were taken away. We haven't been able to get new U.S. seafood import data since the government shutdown on October 1st, so I only have numbers through July. Over the first 7 months of 2025, U.S. importers have paid more than $797 million in tariffs on about $16.5 billion worth of seafood imports. That's a lot more than the $199.5 million in tariffs paid for the $14.7 million worth of imports seen over the first 7 months of 2024. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay, just want to double check. But as soon as we can see what's happened in August and September of this year, I suspect the numbers are going to be a lot worse as tariffs escalate significantly for several big import source countries in August. Goods from India and Brazil, for example, are getting hit with 50% tariffs now. It's hard to keep up, and worse, the application of the new tariffs have not had a straight line effect on seafood imports and prices that are easy to calculate. It's very confusing, and that's why we put together this webinar. We brought together our all-star team of seafood price analysts that break it down for you today. Gary Morrison, Lorin, Castiglione, and Ben Fisher. And what you're seeing, what Gary just put up on the screen for us there, is the front page of the product that they work on. It's pretty intuitive and relatively easy to use. And once you get the hang of it, it's a great tool. Our experts are going to cover a lot of ground today and won't get to all the many species we cover, but we're going to focus most heavily on the biggest seafood commodities that folks generally care about most. And so let's get started. This session is being recorded, and we'll send you access to that recording after the presentation is over. Feel free to shoot us questions as we go, and we'll try to slip those in when we have a minute between presentations. Gary, talk to us about what's happening as a result of tariffs in the shrimp market.
Thanks, Jason, and thank you everyone for joining us today. The global shrimp market is in a state of flux due to these significant trade policy Jason just referenced. So in the shrimp part of the presentation, I'm going to cover 3 critical areas that I think impact everyone the most: the recent shift in U.S. import volumes, the new reciprocal tariff landscape, and other trade policy impacts, and what changes have meant and what these changes have meant for costs and pricing. So a little bit of a U.S. import landscape, the overall picture. Imports saw a slight decline in volume and value in 2024 to about 1.68 billion pounds, coming down from the peak of 2021, where we hit nearly 2 billion pounds. We know that that 2021 import volume was coming out of the COVID-19 era, when the world was reopening, and there was outsized imports because retailers and restaurants continued to buy at the pace that we saw. The retailers during COVID-19 in 2020, when the world was shut down and everybody was buying shrimp to cook at home, and restaurants, as they were reopening, looked right prior to closing and what their sales number was. So everybody was competing, and we had a glut of shrimp in the market at that time. The market was oversupplied, and as a result, it took 2 years really for a drawdown in inventory as prices hit multi-year lows. But if you really look at it, the overall trend is pretty much intact. I mean, if we look at how imports really see the growth, it continued on a consistent path. So again, 2021 was an outsized gain, but I think the rate of growth has returned to normal. So despite the declines recently, I think we're on a continued path that we've seen over the last 10 years, right? So if we're looking at the top trade partners here, we can simply move our trade portal and intuitively change to where we are. We all know that India is the #1 trade partner in terms of volume and value, with 2024, 650 million pounds sent to the U.S., worth about $2.4 billion. Ecuador, second, at 413 million pounds at 1.3 billion, and Indonesia 297 million pounds at 1.1 billion. So these policies have started to shift things. I mean, COVID-19 really was the driver of some of the changes for Ecuador, right? So Ecuador was a distant third, prior to that, but they were forced, because of trade flows and shutdowns, to diversify their partners. And the U.S. made sense. They were willing to pay for shrimp. They had a consumer that was now demanding more and more, and they had a close proximity. So shipping was certainly nice and easy for them. And Ecuador has gone from a 17% of our import volume in 2020 to 27% in 2024. So that concentrated effort to diversify their customer base has certainly continued, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more in this webinar as well. Looking at some of the other trends over the last couple of years, India and Ecuador saw volume declines last year, but that was relative to some of the other countries thinking about tariffs coming into the U.S. prior, and Vietnam and Thailand saw increases because they wanted to get anything in here because there was anticipation of some sort of tariff environment into the United States. So that's kind of looking at imports, and you can see what's going on there. Now, what's going on here currently if we change this to a little bit looking at biannual, you can see that the first half of 2025 saw a significant surge in shrimp imports into the United States, and that's where every country rushed product in ahead of tariff implementation dates. And so certainly that was expected. What the implication of that was that most people would have thought that the wholesale and the prices would have moved higher, and that the wholesale prices would have followed suit. But it provided an inventory cushion and buffered the wholesale market for a little bit. And we're going to get into that later in the third part when we talk about costs and pricing. Right. But let's not just remember that it's not only the tariffs that we're talking about here. It's in the backdrop of anti-dumping duties and countervailing duties. So let's just define them a little bit so that we kind of understand that. But anti-dumping duties are tariffs placed on imported shrimp or other goods where the U.S. Government has felt there was unfair competition because of the product was sold at a lower price. Countervailing duties were placed on shrimp. As we saw, there was some subsidies or foreign government assistance to help them, sell at a lower price. And now we add into that our reciprocal tariffs, right? So they're placed in response to what the administration felt were imbalances in trade or some unfair practices. So the shrimp industry has been dealing with not only tariffs, but anti-dumping and countervailing duties over the last 12 to 18 months. And you put them all together, and there are some numbers that are clearly, outsized, and we'll get to that in a little bit. So the shock was that the reciprocal tariffs were imposed by the current administration on our major partners, and this is what's creating the trade balance, just as the industry was balancing AD and CVDs, right? So if we go into the specific countries' impact analysis of what's going on, Asia, this is where the major pain point is, right? India, they're facing the highest effective combined duty up to nearly 60%. This is effectively priced the largest supplier out of the U.S. market overnight. Their anti-dumping duty was 2.49%, their countervailing duty 5.77%, and now reciprocal tariffs of not only the initial 25%, but the additional 25% make it almost impossible to compete. But as we'll hear later, there's still going to be a major source of imports just because of product forms and some of their competitive advantages they have over some of the other countries. Vietnam and Indonesia, they were also hit with significant combined duties, 23% approximately for Indonesia, 49% for Vietnam. So this is also drastically reducing their price competitiveness. And if this wasn't enough, Indonesia also had some other headwinds in the form of the FDA Import Alert 9951 that blocked all shrimp imported into the U.S. Because of the radioactive cesium-137 that was detected. If you look at it from a import perspective, Indonesia accounts for approximately 17 to 20% of all imports. And really the majority of easy peel shrimp, something that's very common in the retail sector, comes from Indonesia. So a little bit of timeline on this. August 14th is when the notice of elevated amounts of cesium-137 were detected. So import restrictions were imposed. Luckily, late in the year, October, the Indonesian government and the U.S. government came to some agreement where new mandatory import certification requirements were implemented so that anything that was on the water by October 13th can get here by the October 31st date that's coming up tomorrow. So as of tomorrow, all shipments from the island of Java and the Lampung province must be accompanied by an official radioactive credential certification, right? So
Hey,
what's
Gary,
that? Yeah.
Can I stop you for a second?
Mhm.
A lot of folks in the chat room are saying that the charts are, you're not seeing the bottom of the charts. I don't know if there's a way you can amend how you're showing them.
Yeah, I'm scrolling down, scrolling through them now.
Okay. And the other thing I'm thinking is if you could put your cursor over one of those bars when you do that kind of thing, because then it'll show like the numbers that are visible, and they only need to see the most recent probably, but like they'll get the gist of like what it's measuring.
Mhm.
You know what I'm saying?
Well, can you see that one now? So we're talking about Indonesian shrimp, and the majority of easy peel shrimp into the United States come through it. So you can see a pretty stagnant price structure in the U.S. wholesale market throughout the beginning of 2025, and then a little surge up, and then a significant surge once we add tariffs and the blockage of imports into the United States. So certainly, what it's doing to the price there. Now, if you look at Latin America, that's where you would see the tariff advantage, right? And you would think that some things would certainly be more beneficial for Ecuador, especially. So let's see what's happening with some of the Ecuador shrimp and how that's impacting the market. So right now, Ecuador enjoys the lowest rate of around 19%, right? CVD of 3.78 and reciprocal tariffs of 15%. So we talked about what was happening after COVID, where Ecuador was really focusing on the U.S. By necessity, but now they're doing it because they want to. They are ramping up output and shifting focus to highly wanted by the U.S. consumer value-added categories like peeled and deveined. But while they had a tariff advantage, if you look at this chart of 1620 P&D tail on in the U.S. wholesale market from Latin American producers as well as Asian, they're pretty much on parity here in the U.S., right? So, what's causing that? The Latin producers, while they're trying to shift their supply chain here to the U.S., the problem is capacity, right? So they just can't produce enough for that excess demand that the U.S. consumer wants. And when I was at the Global Shrimp Forum, one of the major Latin producers used this example, and I think it's really good. If you were getting 100 containers a month, or from an Indian producer, or even a Latin producer, and now you need to add 20 more containers, Ecuador can only maybe give you that one additional or two additional because of capacity issues. So they brought prices straight up to the tariff ceiling that the Asian competitors had. So prices are on parity right now. And again, you can see that prices rallied from the initial April 2nd date to July about 15%, 24%, and then another 15%, till now. So, prices continue to rise, and I think that's, what we're seeing. So we've talked a little bit about what's happening in trade flows, some of the reasons behind it in tariffs. Now let's talk about some of the wholesale pricing dynamics and the current price reaction and cost structures. The wholesale pricing has been complex. All shrimp prices moved higher initially when reciprocal tariffs were announced, but they had a second leg up midsummer. And, this was pretty broad-based. And what that's telling the market and what's that signaling to the market is that cheap inventory of that preloaded imports into the United States is now gone. So all shrimp being sold now has those higher costs associated with it. And I know that we've talked about India, and the U.S. government has certainly discussed lowering that tariff rate to 15, 18% is what's reported in the news. And, that could be a good thing because if not for that, any Indian shrimp here that comes will have that significant higher cost associated with it. And importers will have to, make a decision of passing all of that, some of it, or absorb, that. And the margins aren't really there to have the ability to absorb all of it. So there's going to be some costs that are passed along. And when we talked about what happened in, these prices and what the impact was and where everyone would have thought that Ecuador had the advantage. But you got to remember, it's having the right shrimp in the U.S. So there are product forms such as, cooked and breaded and species black tiger that we simply cannot source anywhere else. So if you look at it, we talked about, P&D. Yes, you can origin shop a little bit, but Latin America has a capacity issue. But it's really, some of those other forms, easy peel, cooked. And if we looked at a cooked 16 to 20, the chart will pop up, and it's similar to, what happened in the rest of the industry, like a single leg up, and then the second one up here, and then, certainly, 40% rise in prices. And we have to remember, we are coming off the backdrop of multi-year lows into a more, 10-year average. So that's something that must be remembered as well. But it's not only, some of these other cooked. If we go to black tiger shrimp, similar, response there as well. Again, this is why we're talking about India and other Asian countries are gonna be important partners. They have product forms, they have types that the U.S. consumer wants and that people can't origin shop, and they have capabilities and long-term relationships with U.S. importers that aren't going to be broken overnight, right? So a little bit on the U.S. wholesale, we've seen prices move up into this time period, and that's also impacted at the retail level. So according to Anne-Marie Roerink at 210 Analytics, shrimp prices rose 8.6% from September 2024 to 2025, and that reduced volume sales by nearly 13%. So it's starting to have an impact to the U.S. consumer. So what are some of the factors that we're looking at? They're going to influence price. With the lower priced inventory gone that we talked about, the higher cost inventory is here. So those costs are going to have to be passed along either in partial or in full. We expect the second half imports to slow, but they could surprise to the upside as we need shrimp forms and types that haven't been imported and having a tough time replaced in the current trading environment. And we're going to look at demand at these higher prices. So September gave us a 1 month glimpse of, what happened at the retail level. We're going to look for a longer term trend to see if that influences any demand destruction. Some of the key market risks that we are looking at are supply chain bottlenecks. Can Latin America scale fast enough to meet U.S. demand without driving prices significantly higher or come out of their comfort zone? We're already seeing slower shipping times from Ecuador to the U.S., so that's something that we're going to keep a watch on. And then we're going to certainly watch quickly shifting trade policies, right? We've already talked that India and the U.S. are discussing a framework for a deal to reduce those tariffs from 50% to some other number that's been talked about, 15 to 18%, which is long-term bullish for the industry because that will certainly help future imports. But there will also be some short-term kinks with that as the higher priced inventory that is here needs to be sold. So will importers' dollar cost average on the way down or at current prices is similar the way they did on the way up? And then we'll be looking for retail acceptance and consumer acceptance. So will the end consumer continue to accept higher prices after hitting multi-year lows recently? And really, the key takeaways from this and, being in the shrimp market this year is the market is rebalancing away from Asia towards Latin America where it can. But Asia still will be an important partner given their expertise in certain areas and certain product forms. And I think tariffs are here to stay in some form or another. And it's not just supply and demand that are going to be the dominant price and cost driver. So I appreciate the time today talking about the shrimp market, and we'll certainly get to any questions after we hear from some of the other presenters.
Gary, we don't have any indication so far how much shrimp India has sent to the U.S. since those new tariffs, do we?
No, the government shutdown, gives statistics a break. So no, we haven't got any of that data yet. Again, I know we talked about it, Jason, in length in a conversation about a week ago, but we do expect that India and those other Asian countries will be shipping in probably similar market share here to the U.S. Because of those product forms that people can't find anywhere else, and those species that people can't find anywhere else. The overall pie might shrink a little bit in August, September, October, but we suspect that they're still going to be an important partner.
There was a sense at one point that restaurants were burning through the cheap shrimp, as you discussed. However, leading up to those new tariff rates, there was a flood or an accelerated pace of imports. Do you think that folks have burned through that inventory already?
Yeah, for the most part, I think most of the cheap inventory is gone.
So there's a need, there's a desire still to import more shrimp. It's not like they filled the bank and they don't need to go out and get any more. They still need to get more shrimp.
They do. I mean, again, it's about having the right type and the right size shrimp as well. So typically, headless shell on and head on shell on are held a little bit longer. And then, your cooked, your P&D, your easy peel, you continue to import, those, throughout, longer periods. So, I think as people shift, especially in the U.S., people are shifting towards convenience. They're shifting towards ease. And now importers are starting to do the same. And I think they have to go out and find some of that. And again, these forms and these types, we didn't have much, except for peeled. You started seeing peeled increase in the first half of 2025 pretty significantly.
Okay. Thanks, Gary. That was incredibly informative. A lot of material was covered, and we've got a lot more to go. Let's shift gears now and head over to Lorin, who's going to talk to us about how tariffs are hitting the salmon, tilapia, and groundfish markets. Are you there, Lorin?
All right, let's try. Yes, despite added tariff costs, U.S. wholesale prices for farmed Atlantic salmon haven't spiked in the dramatic way some expected. What's happening instead is a reshaping of trade flows and competitive positioning. It's not a simple pass-through of tariff costs. So I'm going to walk you through why that is and how Chile, Norway, and Canada are each uniquely positioned in this environment. So let's begin with Chile. Chile is the dominant supplier of Atlantic salmon to the U.S. Here in this U.S. import chart from our trade portal, and Chile is in blue. Chile accounts for roughly 70% of U.S. fresh Atlantic salmon fillet imports. This was for July, just to give some perspective. So it makes its behavior especially important in how pricing evolves. So when we look at pricing, starting in April, making sure that's all viewable on the screen, around week 15, Chilean salmon became subject to 10% tariff coming into the U.S. Now, while pricing did edge higher initially, the market was already in an upward trajectory due to increased seasonal demand heading into Mother's Day. After that holiday peak, demand historically tapers, and at the same time, we saw excess volumes coming into the U.S. So even though demand saw upticks from Lent and Valentine's Day and Mother's Day this year, it wasn't as much of a lift compared to previous years. This combination prompted a correction, not because tariffs weren't significant, but because seasonality and oversupply had a stronger immediate influence than the tariff costs. We saw this play out throughout early summer as the market entered its slower demand season. Prices softened through June and July before stabilizing more recently. Production patterns shifted across major supplying regions and tightening available supply, which I'll get into in just a bit when I jump into Norway. But since tariffs took effect, Chile has strategically shifted more focus towards Brazil and China, where there aren't tariff risks and returns are often stronger. However, the U.S. remains a very important market, not because it offers the highest margin, but because it absorbs the largest volume, and there's no other single market that can replicate that. Now, looking at Norway, the origin where we've seen some dramatic price volatility this year. Norwegian salmon became subject to 10% tariff rate before increasing to 15% in August. While you would expect that a higher tariff rate would push prices significantly higher, what actually happened was that prices swung sharply up and down throughout 2025 as Norway responded to a complex mix of biological, seasonal, and global market forces. And strong production set the stage. Norway entered 2025 with unusually strong biomass due to an exceptionally mild winter. There were warmer temperatures, fewer biological challenges, and expanded vaccine use that meant that there was a higher share of fish harvested this year that were superior grade, meaning more product was entering the fresh market rather than being processed and frozen. So this improved quality made Norwegian product very attractive to U.S. buyers that are willing to pay a premium for consistency. As a result, U.S. import volumes of fresh Norwegian salmon fillets are reporting higher on a year-to-date basis compared to 2024, despite those tariff pressures, and you can see the elevated volumes here. So tariffs introduced added volatility, not a straight price increase. When tariffs were introduced in April, Norwegian prices initially spiked heading into Easter week when limited harvest activity was creating a temporary squeeze. But within just 2 weeks, prices collapsed, dropping over 20% on fillets as more volume entered the market and seasonal demand eased. This kind of set the tone for the rest of the year, a series of sharp rallies followed by sharp corrections, driven by a combination of tariffs, export volumes, and global demand shifts. Throughout the summer, heavy Norwegian export volumes kept downwards pressure on U.S. prices, even as tariffs moved up to 15%. In August, when the tariff took effect, Norwegian prices actually fell to match Chilean levels. By September, the market turned again. Chinese demand surged ahead of Golden Week, and that was pulling larger fish out of the European and the US markets, driving prices sharply higher. So with Norway, it isn't just tariffs made product more expensive. It's that tariffs added a new layer of volatility and uncertainty to this market. Pricing has been driven far more by export pace, Chinese buying behavior, and biological conditions rather than tariffs alone. And despite the increased import volumes this year, I am hearing from contacts that buyers are pulling back because of this, the extreme price swings out of Norway. But we're still seeing plenty of import volume there. And now turning to Canada. Chart looks a little bit different here, but I will get into that. Canada is a supplier that until now has held a significant advantage over other origins. Canada has benefited from tariff-free status under the USMCA trade agreement, at least as of today's webinar, and I'll get back to that shortly. Its proximity to the US allows for fast, fresh delivery, and the majority of Canadian salmon enters the market as fresh whole fish, which traditionally commands a premium due to its quality and logistical efficiency. But unlike Chile and Norway, Canada's story in 2025 has been driven less by policy and far more by biology. Throughout 2025, Canadian producers endured some of the most challenging farming conditions. We saw mortality events triggered by warming waters, low oxygen levels, harmful algae. There was a sharp surge in sea lice infestations, forcing emergency harvesting, and that resulted in heavy volumes of product entering the market. These emergency harvests forced producers to accelerate harvesting, which temporarily flooded the market with supply right as demand was seasonal and soft. And that contributed to sharp price declines, which is why you also see those dotted lines over the last few weeks of Canadian assessments. So our methodology only allows us to provide assessments where there is adequate spot market trade taking place, and we cannot report product being bought under duress. So while assessments may be temporarily removed, we still continue to speak to market happenings in our commentary. So despite the biological disruptions and volatility, the tariff exemption allowed Canadian product to remain competitive and maintain a foothold in the US market alongside Chile and Norway. However, that advantage is now under threat. On October 25th, President Trump announced his intention to impose an additional 10% tariff on top of Canadian goods. And it remains unclear whether seafood will be included, but this announcement has introduced a major uncertainty at the exact moment that the Canadian industry is already strained. So looking ahead, the medium-term risk is significant. If tariffs are applied, Canadian suppliers may need to raise prices or shift volume towards markets where they have tariff certainty, such as Japan and Asia under the Trans-Pacific Partnership Free Trade Agreement. Some contacts have reported that the emergency harvested fish were currently at or near full market size, but that a large share of volume was set to be harvested in the middle of next year. So while emergency harvests are behind us, the full impact may still be seen into next year.
Hey, Lorin, can I just ask you a couple questions real quick?
If you shall. If you must.
Well, I mean, it's funny that you mentioned that the fear that 10% tariff might be applied to Canadian goods. We went through that earlier, and there was a lot of paranoia that the tariffs that were going to be applied to everybody else would hit Canada. And then right up to the last moment when the White House said, no, it doesn't apply to seafood. I guess we can't count on that every time. It seems like we are just living by the moment. The last time when that happened, by the way, we saw snow crab imports spike because I think they thought, oh, the tariffs are coming. We've got to get the product into the country. I don't know what's going to happen this time, but that seems kind of scary to me.
Yeah, one of the biggest thing that I've noticed from the first round of tariffs that we went through in Trump's first term versus this one is that the industry is much less reactive to these announcements. When they announce something, they're not immediately making moves, making shifts. They're waiting until it's absolutely confirmed, because things have shifted back and forth so much. So there's much less reactiveness this time around that I'm seeing.
We'll find out if that was wise or not, I guess.
Mhm.
You focused a lot on fresh here, but frozen salmon pricing is reacting a little differently, isn't it?
Yeah, so frozen salmon moves on a much longer sales cycle. That means pricing is a little bit slower to react in either direction. We did see pricing firm on frozen salmon from Chile and Norway when tariffs went into effect, but we also saw them fall and soften when we got into those slower demand seasons. So we're still seeing the ebbs and flows of pricing, even with the tariffs in effect there.
All right. Well, I guess it's time to move on to the next subject. We've seen how a high volume premium protein like salmon is adapting to tariffs, but the story looks kind of different when you talk about tilapia, a value species, and far more sensitive to cost inflation. Let's shift to tilapia now. What's the latest on tariff developments out of China, and how are U.S. wholesale prices reacting?
Yeah, so Chinese tilapia has faced one of the most aggressive tariff escalations of any seafood product. Having entered 2025 with an already 25% Section 301 tariff, we saw escalations in February and in March and in April of this year, encroaching on an almost 200% tariff rate, which would have killed any sort of trade coming into the U.S. But in May, we reached a trade agreement that brought those levels down to 55%, which they still stand at today. But that deal expires this November. Without it, tariffs automatically jump back to triple digits, which is unsustainable for a value finfish item or any item for that matter. But these tariff swings had a big direct impact on pricing behavior. The first half of the year, you can see from this chart, is that U.S. wholesale tilapia prices moved higher as importers bought aggressively ahead of expected tariff increases. Prices peaked in late spring, but then began retreating as demand slowed. Inventories built up and buyers shifted to a wait-and-see mode. You can see on the screen, current wholesale prices are steady, sitting roughly 25 cents below the levels that we were at a year ago. That's from oversupply and cautious demand. They've overshadowed that tariff-driven cost inflation. So despite tariffs, the market hasn't really surged because the U.S. is so oversupplied at the moment. I do want to peek quickly at what's happening on the ground in China to offer a little bit more insight there. These are raw material pricing from major producing regions like Hainan, Guangxi, and Guangdong, and they've been under pressure. You can see that steep drop in prices as of recent. So producers have reduced operations and farmers have cut stocking levels because margins are near break-even levels, and those farm gate prices have dramatically weakened. On the import side, arrivals are still strong, up about 23% year to date through July compared to last year. Some of that increase came from pre-tariff stocking earlier in the year, and it continues to weigh on the market today. So we're in a position where tariffs are high, cost of production remains high, but selling prices have fallen. Margins at origin are under severe pressure, but U.S. importers are not willing to bring in more product and take advantage of the lower replacement costs because the inventories here in the U.S. are already heavy. Just earlier this month, President Trump floated the idea of a 100% tariff on Chinese goods, which sent another shockwave through the market. He later softened that stance, but the uncertainty alone is enough to freeze forward buying activity. But President Trump is in Asia this week, and we're all waiting with bated breath to hear of any new developments. We do know that U.S. Treasury Secretary indicated that trade talks with China were progressing and suggested that an additional 100% tariff scheduled for November was now effectively off the table. While that does not represent an official cancellation or confirmation, the remarks were widely interpreted that that was a signal that tariff escalation is unlikely in the near term, but, you know, anything goes. So waiting for that final confirmation there.
Now, I know that frozen tilapia from China is like the lion's share of the tilapia market, but
Yes.
what about fresh tilapia? How are they faring with Brazil's 50% tariff?
So the Senate just passed a bill to block that 50% tariff from Brazil. The development's still very fresh, and while that's not translating into any immediate price movement, it's the first meaningful step in unwinding that 50% tariff on Brazilian tilapia, that fresh tilapia. That tariff has been a major driver of elevated fresh tilapia prices in the U.S. So the Senate vote is introducing a sense of cautious optimism, which is very welcomed at the moment.
All right. Tilapia isn't the only species caught in the policy crossfire. Groundfish, particularly cod and haddock, are facing their own mix of tariffs, sanctions, and supply disruptions, fundamentally reshaping pricing. Let's get into groundfish. What are you seeing there?
Yeah, so specifically, I'll speak to cod and haddock here, where tariffs, supply constraints, and geopolitical pressures have combined to drive some of the strongest price movements that we've seen across any seafood category this year. I will start with single frozen product from Iceland. Iceland's a strategic supplier that's under pressure. You can see here, I've got both cod and haddock. Cod's in blue and haddock is in green. Prices began sharply rising at the end of 2024 and never looked back. On a year-to-date basis, Icelandic cod in blue is now trading over $3 per pound higher than this time last year. And that's largely driven by a severe supply shortage with added support from Iceland's 10% tariff. So Iceland is one of the primary suppliers of single frozen Atlantic cod to the US, but it's also supplying into high demand markets in the UK and the EU, limiting what's available for the US buyers. On top of that, the Barents Sea quota was reduced by 25% this year, with early signals suggesting another 21% reduction next year. Russia, historically a major cod source, remains banned from the US market, and Chinese processed cod is at risk of higher tariffs, adding costs and uncertainty there. So this isn't so much a demand-driven rally, it's supply and tariff positioning story here. With Russia banned and China penalized and quotas tightening, Iceland's become one of the few viable sources left, and that's why we're seeing these record price levels. Unlike cod, Iceland actually increased its haddock quota for the 2025-2026 season, but prices still climbed. We've seen volatile auction prices in Iceland. There's rising operational costs. There's strong pull from European buyers. Plus, as cod became too expensive for some buyers, demand flowed into haddock, lifting prices in its wake. So cod set the ceiling, haddock is pulled up behind it, and tariffs are amplifying that upwards pressure, limiting alternatives. Now, looking at twice frozen, and you see that same trend. Tariff volatility has added another layer of complexity here. We've got ongoing tariff uncertainty throughout the year, causing U.S. importers to delay or pull back on orders, and that's disrupting the natural flow or the normal flow of shipments into the U.S. Some processing has shifted out of China to alternative countries, resulting in bottlenecks, higher freight costs, and longer lead times. And despite all of this, demand has remained intact. The prices have continued to firm as buyers prioritize security of supply here. Now, twice frozen haddock faces a major policy turning point. we have two forces at play in twice frozen haddock that could significantly reshape the market going into 2026. The first is the Section 301 tariff exemption. Currently, haddock enjoys an exemption under Section 301 tariffs, but that exemption is only extended through the end of November. If it expires, we could see an additional 25% applied on top of the existing duty on Chinese product. And the second is the Marine Mammal Protection Act that's effective January 1st of 2026. NOAA is expected to enforce a ban on finished haddock products made from Russian raw materials, even if it's processed in China. This will effectively close one of the last remaining loopholes for Russian haddock entering the US. So if both those events go into effect, the US could lose a critical supply stream at the same time tariffs increase, creating one of the tightest haddock markets we've seen in a really long time.
All right, Lorin, you know how this stuff changes by the minute. And as soon as we sort of write our stories and get our stuff together.
Was there an announcement while I was going through that?
Yeah, this morning there was we had the story. Apparently, China has a trade deal that'll bring tilapia tariffs down to, I think, 45%. But we'll have to get more on that. I mean, we were jamming to get this thing together, and that story broke literally this morning. And this is what it's like to be an Undercurrent news reporter. Like every 5 minutes, it seems like there's a new truth social post or something, and we've got to jump on it. It keeps changing.
Well, it'll be in my write-up tomorrow on the blog. So
yes, I'm sure you'll get on top of that. So all right. So following that last conversation, which market should we be watching most closely over the next 60 days?
Out of all of those, well, haddock for sure. Haddock's got a lot of things up against it, yeah, I would be watching closely to haddock. You know, as cod prices have risen, haddock has been more of a focus as a substitution. But because of all that, because of the trade policy, the MMPA, those prices could be in line with where cod is if all those go into effect and demand stays where it is. So we'll be keeping a close eye on that.
This is kind of a broader question. Are these tariff impacts temporary noise, or are we looking at a longer term shift? What is the, will we have scars from this going into the future? What's
Don't we already?
Yeah.
There's definitely long-term shifts building because of the tariffs. Prices in some cases can be quicker to rise, and then, a little bit slower to fall, especially at the retail level. There's more diversification. We're seeing processing kind of, being built up outside of China, sourcing from different origins. So tariffs are definitely making the industry more agile, but it's not without its growing pains.
All right. My favorite topic, and one of your favorite topics, is scallops. How have the scallop markets reacted? Product from Japan, Peru, China. Are we seeing anything different there?
So the scallop market is kind of similar to groundfish, where there's just supply constraints across the origins, and tariffs are just adding another layer of upwards pressure to that. There's limited landings here on the domestic front. There's constraints out of Canada. There's constraints out of Japan. There's, China has, all the tariff uncertainty there. There's some, a little bit better positioning out of Peru. But, there's, in the grand scheme of things, it's majorly driven by supply issues on the scallop front.
Okay. Last question for you. Given the rising costs we've seen on imported products, has there been any impact on domestic species like Pacific cod?
Yes, absolutely. So the rising costs on imported species, we've definitely seen increased interest in tariff-safe domestic alternatives like Pacific cod. That added demand combines with tighter raw material availability, higher production costs, that has helped lift Pacific cod pricing this year. Not to the levels of Atlantic cod, but we're seeing those same trends.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Lorin. I'm going to move over quickly. We've got about 10 minutes left. Let's get Ben in here to talk about Seabass and seabream. Ben, you there?
I am here.
All right, let's go.
So, Undercurrent launched its U.S. wholesale Mediterranean sea bass and seabream price assessment back in May. That was right after the President Trump Liberation Day tariff announcement. And as a result, we've been able to really capture how the U.S. market has responded to those tariffs in the months since. And in a word, the market has seen higher prices. We'll get to that first. We'll get to that later. But first, I'd like to take a look at some of the countries of origin that we are tracking here in our assessment. So if you look at the Undercurrent trade portal, you'll be able to see the U.S.'s largest trading partners for fresh sea bass and seabream. The top 5 individual countries are up here. You'll find Turkey, Greece, Spain, Japan, and the Netherlands. And our price assessment focuses on Turkish and Greek origin, as those two countries make up about 3/4 of U.S. imports of fresh sea bass and seabream. In terms of value, we'll switch over to that chart so you can see how much the U.S. is bringing in. And as far as values goes, the U.S. imported close to $200 million worth of fresh sea bass and seabream last year in 2024. Now, we just heard about shrimp and salmon, and compared to those markets, that's not the most earth-shattering amount, but it's certainly a fast-growing market in the U.S. With the exception of 2020, the pandemic year, import values and volumes have grown for each of the last 10 years. As we talked about earlier, data for 2025 just goes up to July, but figures are on pace to exceed numbers from last year in 2024. When we discuss tariffs on these two origins, we have currently the same rate of 15%. But these rates have been shifting. They weren't always sitting at the same number. For example, back in April on Trump's so-called Liberation Day, the president announced that the EU would face a 20% tariff, while Turkey would be subject to the 10% global rate. Then the EU was threatened with a 30% tariff, which led to all sorts of discussions about how this would be advantageous for Turkish fish and farmers. But again, the rates now for the EU bloc and Turkey have evened out at 15% when the tariffs came into effect on August 7th. So as you can see, assuming that this is about half of the year here in 2025, we're on track to, as I said, overtake the 2024 numbers. We're talking about the rates. Sources tell us that in many cases, the portion of the tariff is being eaten by the EU or the Turkish side of the market, and that 15% rate isn't entirely reflected in U.S. wholesale prices. Here are our most recent U.S. wholesale prices, our price assessment, which has been flat for bass and bream for the last few weeks. We assess 3 sizes of sea bass and 2 sizes of sea bream, both on an FOB East Coast basis. And these prices, like all the other U.S. wholesale categories, are reported on a weekly basis every Wednesday. And if you look at recent pricing for something like 600 to 800 gram sea bass, looking at week 35, which was the last week of August, was when wholesale prices began to rise. So it took a couple of weeks for the tariff to sort of work its way through the system from August 7th until the end of the month. If you look at prices from week 34 to now, that average price for a 600 to 800 gram sea bass has gone up from about $6.03 per pound to $6.50 per pound. That's an increase of about 8%. Which again does suggest that some of this tariff is being swallowed on the other side of the Atlantic. But tariffs are not the only thing having an impact on bass and bream wholesale prices. As you can see, prices have been rising since before the tariffs were announced in April. The price increases earlier in the year were due in large part to supply issues. There have been severe heat mortality events in the Mediterranean each of the last 2 summers, which have killed off fish. With good demand on both the European and the American sides of the Atlantic, this has led to a real shortage and has driven prices up. Mediterranean sea temperatures in Turkey hit 30 degrees Celsius, which is about 86 degrees Fahrenheit this summer, which was really not welcome news for farmers who had just contended with the same situation last year. Larger fish are more susceptible to this type of heat mortality event, and there's been a real shortage of 800-gram and larger fish on the market. If you're looking to get a feel of what prices have done recently on the other side of the Atlantic without taking into account tariffs, we also have global pricing. And so, for instance, you could look at the Merca Madrid pricing for Greek origin sea bass and seabream, which have remained steady over recent weeks after a similar supply-driven run-up earlier in the year. Back to U.S. wholesale pricing, we're at a bit of a crossroads now. One bass and bream supplier has recently reduced prices, suggesting that the recent run-up has had a negative effect on demand, and that's even as the new generation of fish not affected by these heat mortality events are ready or close to ready for harvest. And another supplier, on the other hand, is weighing another price hike. And we will just have to see which way we go.
All right. Okay, so that was awesome, Ben. Thank you very much. We're going to wrap up now. We're getting close to the end of the hour. But before we wrap, just a quick reminder that the full recording of today's sessions will be shared with everyone who registered. You'll also be able to find it on undercurrentnews.com. And if you'd like to access our full set of weekly wholesale prices, global prices, trade data, please visit our website or contact the UCN team directly. Thanks for everyone who joined us and who watches this later in a recording. I really appreciate you participating. Thank you.